It was a late evening in 1917 when Corporal Thomas Caldwell stood at the edge of the trenches, his boots sinking into the muddy ground of the French battlefield. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder, and the distant sound of artillery echoed through the valley like the growl of an angry beast. Thomas, barely 20 years old, felt the pang of homesickness stab at him as he stared into the darkness. He had enlisted not long after the war broke out, driven by a sense of duty and a wish to get away from the tedious life in a small Scottish village. He left his younger sister, Lily, and their aging father. He was hoping to please them. Thomas had had faith in the cause. He had thought that even if he did not himself survive, at least for family's sake, he will make it through. But as weeks bled into months, Thomas found himself struggling to hold onto that belief. The trenches were not that gallant battlefield he had dreamt of. Instead, it was a hell where soldiers lived in squalor and fought not for glory, but to stay alive. Endless bombardments, stench of death, rows of men, some living and some dying, had already begun breaking him. He no longer knew whom he was fighting for, and the very concept of survival now resembled a sarcastic joke rather than victory. That night, after the sun went down and the cold wind swept through the trench, Thomas felt a weight settle over him. It was not just the weight of the war, or death all around him. It was something else. He looked out toward the dark horizon, his heart racing. In the distance, he saw something unusual. A pale figure, barely visible against the blackness, moved slowly along the front lines. "Who is there?" he shouted to the night, his voice trembling. There was no answer. The silhouette walks, its form taking better definition as it came. He saw it was a man dressed in rags and tatters of uniform. His face was impossible to make out because the shadow was so deep upon him. But Thomas had noticed something else. Down across his neck was a groove in the flesh. This man had been dead, but for blood that still seeped down from the gash. Thomas felt like his blood had run ice. Others didn't notice, but some others who were standing around there at that moment were staring also, their faces pale as the moon and their limbs paralyzed as well. "What in God's name is that?" someone whispered. The figure was closing in on it, moving slowly, deliberately making Thomas's flesh crawl with every inch gained. He sat there paralyzed, his brain racing in wild circles to make some meaning out of what he was witnessing. The soldiers surrounding him held frozen in silence, unable even to move or say something. Bun, like he had popped into view just now. He vanished as well, into the wind and into nowhere. Thomas barely noticed those following days. He had indeed gone ahead to report the weird figure in front of his commanding officer. However, just like anyone else would predict, this claim was thrown into the garbage can. "No ghosts in this war, Caldwell," his captain chided gruffly. "Focus on the living, not the dead." But Thomas could not rid his mind of the image. He started questioning everything he thought he knew. The war, death, and life itself. Could it be that those soldiers who had fallen here, who had died for a cause they barely knew, were still here? Perhaps trapped in the eternal nightmare of the battlefield, their souls unable to rest. It was during one of the fiercest battles of the war that Thomas's own fate took a turn. They had been ordered to charge the enemy lines, to push forward through the thick fog of smoke and gunfire. The air was thick with the cries of men and the clatter of rifle shots. Bodies fell around him, their faces twisted in terror or agony. But Thomas kept running, pushing forward, unwilling to look back. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the ground, the world spinning around him. His chest burned from the blast of a nearby shell and his legs felt numb. Blood stained his uniform, and as he tried to sit up, a sharp pain shot through his side. He could barely breathe, let alone move. "Help!" he shouted, his throat raw, but no one came. The battlefield was an infernal maze of ditches and bodies, and he was just another dead soldier. Then, through the mist, he saw something unexplainable. Figures marching toward him. They were soldiers, but they did not look like any soldiers he ever saw. Their faces were gaunt and pale. Their uniforms were in rags, and blood had not yet dried on their bodies, as if they'd been fighting in the battle since eternity. "You're not alone," one of them whispered, a voice Thomas didn't recognize. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the voice of the figure from the night before. The soldiers knelt beside him, their eyes hollow and distant. But there was no warmth in their gaze, no compassion. They looked at him as if he were just another casualty, another piece of the war to be claimed by death. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, struggling to stay conscious. "Who are you?" "We are the forgotten," the soldier whispered, "the ones who fell and never rose. We fight on, but we're not living. Not anymore." Thomas's breath came fast as a cutting, biting wind started blowing across the field. The people around him began to disappear, become transparent, their forms flickering like a dying candle. But one stayed put, a figure he knew. It was the same soldier he had seen the night before, the one with the wound in his neck. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice weak. "What do you want from me?" The ghostly soldier's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Thomas felt something beyond fear. There was an emptiness in those eyes, a sadness so deep that it seemed to swallow him whole. "We want peace," the soldier whispered. "But peace doesn't come for those who die here." Then, with a final, chilling look, the soldier vanished, leaving Thomas alone in the cold silence of the battlefield. When Thomas woke up, he could hear the sounds of guns and shouting from afar. He was no longer on the battlefield, but back in the trench where he had begun. His wounds had been dressed, though his side ached with the memory of the battle. He sat up, dazed, and found his comrades feverishly working around him. "You're alive, Caldwell," one of them said, his face marked by shock. "We thought you were dead." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. His mind felt foggy, as though the line between reality and nightmare had blurred. Had he truly seen those ghostly soldiers, or had it been a hallucination brought on by the horrors of the war? The more he thought about it, the more unsure he became. The next few nights were similar. Strange happenings, such as the faint sounds of marching soldiers in the distance, whispers in the dark, and fleeting shadows that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. But it wasn't until a week later that Thomas realized the full extent of what he had witnessed. It was a night of silence watch when he again beheld them, ghostly soldiers walking along the trench. Their faces were pale, hollow, but this time they weren't only there in his vision. They were there in the trench with him. The footfalls echoed around him. When he looked into their eyes, he could see nothing but sorrow and the bottomless emptiness. One soldier, the same one with the gash across his neck, stopped in front of Thomas. He reached out, his hand cold as ice, and placed it on Thomas's chest. "We are trapped here," the ghost said, his voice like a whisper in the wind. "We have no rest, and now neither will you." Thomas recoiled, but the ghost's grip was tightening, and for the first time he felt that weight of the war crushing down on him in a way it was not physical but spiritual. The weight of lost lives, of broken promises, of soldiers who had never returned home. Before he finally managed to stop the bloodshed, Thomas was a very different man from the person he had been before. And the spirits of fallen heroes continue haunting him in his slumber, or sometimes amidst people during his waking hours, since the lines between death and life have blurred upon the person. Thomas felt something had become a part of this dark, eternal circle. He went back home to Scotland, but he never felt at peace again. The ghostly soldiers' faces haunted him, their hollow eyes staring at him from every corner. In his mind, he could hear their voices whispering the same thing over and over again. "You are one of us now." Years passed, and Thomas grew old, but the ghosts never left him. They were a constant presence in his life, a reminder of the battlefield that had never truly ended. He died in his sleep one winter night, but as his soul passed from this world, he found himself standing in the cold, muddy trenches once again, surrounded by the same spectral soldiers. And as the wind screamed past him, Thomas knew with a chilling certainty he would never leave the haunted battlefield. The war was not over, not for him, not for any of them. Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. The desert air was dry, stifling, and filled with the scent of dust and decay. Private First Class John Ramirez could feel the weight of the Nevada sun on his neck, the sunburn beginning to sting as he squinted through the endless horizon. He had been stationed here for nearly 6 months, at a place where the world's most secretive experiments were taking place, the infamous Area 51. But in the years he'd been enlisted, John never expected to witness what lay beneath the surface of this place. John had joined the military to escape his troubled past. He had witnessed enough tragedy in a small town in New Mexico. His parents, addicted to something or another, were lost in the grip of their addiction, and he was forced to fend for himself at a very young age. It was the military that got him out, a means of giving his life some semblance of purpose. The concept of serving his country sounded noble, something that made sense even when the rest of his life had sounded like a constant mess. But there was something about Area 51 that unnerved him. The secrecy, the locked doors, the hushed voices in the break rooms, everything felt off. John had overheard whispers about experiments, strange occurrences, and encounters with beings not of this world. He wrote it off as the sort of paranoia that can engulf anyone working in a place like this. But the days began to pass and his doubts grew. Something was amiss. Soldiers stationed with him were jumpy, nervous, distracted. The few who dared speak openly were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. But the eyes told another story. One night changed everything. He'd been working a long, drudging shift of standing watch in one of the less publicized facilities of the base. John saw nothing unusual. Just a night sky dominated by the regular hum of base activities many miles to the north. The stillness of the night was disturbed at various times by the occasional lonely wail of a coyote. But this time, there was trouble with the radar. There it was, a small, flashing point on the screen, a little too tiny to be an airplane, but moving with a speed far too erratic to be a bird. John's chill ran down his spine as he sat back. He watched it flit sideways, then suddenly zip away left. He'd been told to record these things, but a small part of his mind screamed at him to remain silent. Nobody ever listened to the guys who claim they've seen the unbelievable. But tonight, it was different. The ache felt like it was gnawing at him. The next day, John was called to the command center. He arrived to find his superior officer, Captain Ellis, a man who looked as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His face was drawn tight, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed and heavy. "Ramirez," Ellis said, his voice low and serious. "I need you to take a trip with me. A special assignment, not one you can talk about." John's heart was racing. He had heard rumors of special assignments, but no one ever spoke about them openly. They were the kind of missions that left men broken, haunted by things they couldn't unsee. "Where are we going, sir?" John asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of his voice. Ellis hesitated for a moment before answering. "Follow me, we'll brief you on the way." The ride to the unknown facility was long and quiet. Ellis didn't say much, only giving John a few quick glances as if debating whether or not to tell him more. The air inside the Jeep was thick with tension, and John couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Finally, they arrived. It was a place unlike any John had seen on the base, a nondescript building buried deep within the desert sands. The building was reinforced with steel, its windows blacked out. It didn't look like any regular military installation. This place felt different, as though it were hiding something a secret that had been kept for far too long. Inside, they were greeted by a team of scientists, all dressed in white lab coats. Their eyes were wide, almost too wide, and their movements quick and robotic. They didn't seem to notice John at first, focused entirely on a large glass chamber at the center of the room. The chamber was lit with a harsh, sterile light that made everything feel even more unsettling. John's heart sank at a glance into the chamber. In it, on a bed, lay motionless a creature that was not a man. It was thin, with paleness and strange markings around the body that looked almost like some symbols. Its eyes were closed, and his face was oddly serene, as though in some deep sleep. "What is it?" asked John, his voice barely steady. Ellis put a hand on his shoulder, his voice cold. "We don't know. It came from somewhere else." The scientists continued their work, but John couldn't take his eyes off the creature. He wanted to look away, but something held him there, a magnetic pull that drew him closer. The creature's skin was translucent in places, veins pulsing beneath the surface like blue rivers. Then, without warning, the creature's eyes snapped open. John stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat. The creature's gaze locked onto him, and for a brief moment it felt as though the room went silent. Time seemed to stop. Its eyes were not just alien, they were full of knowledge, ancient, terrifying knowledge that made John's blood run cold. The creature's lips moved. Barely audible, but clear enough. "You shouldn't be here." John froze, his pulse hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. The creature didn't make any other movement, but its gaze followed him. It felt like it could see right into the deepest parts of his soul, reading his every thought, every fear. For days after, John's life became a waking nightmare. Whatever this thing was began haunting him. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw the thing's face. Every time he went to look in the mirror, he would swear that he could see this thing standing behind him, reflection and all. Its words kept ringing in his mind. "You shouldn't be here." John tried to ignore it, to focus on his duties, but the whispers grew louder and the hallucinations intensified. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered the base in a daze, searching for answers. He found something he shouldn't have, something tucked away in an abandoned room, hidden from prying eyes. It contained a series of reports, all detailing experiments performed on beings that came from another world. The reports described tests on human subjects who had encountered the aliens in the past, and the horrifying toll those encounters had taken on their minds and bodies. One report in particular caught John's eye. It detailed a soldier who had seen an alien being in the very same chamber that John had visited. The soldier quickly went mad soon after, babbling incoherently about visions of the creature and them telling him to join them in the stars. John's stomach churned as he continued to read. The end of the report had a chilling conclusion. The creature is not here by accident. It was brought here to us, and it knows far more than we think. The words "knows far more than we think" rang in John's ears, filling him with dread. He had thought the military was keeping the truth about aliens hidden, but now he knew it was much worse. They weren't just studying them, They were preparing for something, and whatever it was far too late to stop. John couldn't escape it. The whispers, the visions, everything was closing in on him. His grip on reality was slipping, and he didn't know who to trust anymore. His friends, his comrades, he couldn't look at them without seeing their faces morph into something unrecognizable, their eyes hollow and staring. One night, John snapped. He confronted Captain Ellis, demanding answers. The captain's response was not what John expected. "They will come for you," Ellis said, his voice low and filled with a sense of fear. "You don't understand what we have done. We thought we could control it, but we were wrong. It's too late." Ellis locked his eyes with John's, and for the first time, he saw something in the captain's expression, the flicker of pity that is closest to it. "Run," Ellis whispered. "Before it's too late, you don't want to see what's coming." John didn't need to be told twice. He ran through the halls, out into the vast, empty desert. But the creature's voice followed him, growing louder, its words clearer. "You shouldn't have escaped. You will never leave this place." As he limped through the desolate wasteland, his mind broken, John came to realize that he could not escape. Area 51 was not merely a military base. It was a prison for his soul. And the creatures, whatever they were, had always known that they would be the ones to claim it. The world outside was silent, as if the desert itself had swallowed all sound. And in that stillness, John finally understood. It wasn't just about the aliens. It was about control. Area 51 had become a place of containment, not just for extraterrestrial life, but for the very essence of human fear. It had waited all this time, not for the military to research it, but for it to let go. As John fell back beneath the icy stars, his vision blurring, he saw once again before him the creature's face. "You were never meant to leave," it breathed softly, and now its voice became one with the wind. And then there was nothing. The wind was slicing through the trees like 1,000 whispers. Darkness was so thick it felt as if it might swallow you whole. In the heart of the Cold War, between the looming walls of concrete and barbed wire, were places where silence was the loudest sound of all, places where soldiers became more than just men in uniform. They became ghosts, shadows drifting in the night. This is the story of Lieutenant Anton Fisher, a man whose soul was gone much before his body disappeared into some unknown abyss. It is about the fate of soldier, which was decided not by the brutality of the war, but by the cruelty of a regime founded on falsehood, fear, and control. East Germany, 1963. The world was a powder keg, and every day seemed to be a countdown. Anton Fisher was just 25 when he joined the ranks of the National People's Army. His family had urged him to serve. His father, a stern man who had spent most of his life following the orders of the state, had always told Anton, "Do what you're told, and you'll be safe. Everything else is a risk." But Anton knew the truth deep down. Safety was an illusion. The border between East and West was a grotesque scar on the landscape. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a representation of the palpable fear that gripped the world, and no one, not even the soldiers, was ever immune to its power. These things, Anton had heard all his stories about the men who'd gone nuts to watch and gone from there, about the vanished ones swallowed whole by the black holes of the regime. Nothing about this was ever spoken. Nobody ever said it out, but sensed in the air that something was watching, would take you when you expected it least. One night, Anton was sent to a small, isolated post on the border. It was one of those places where the world seemed to end, where the dark forest met the concrete abyss of the wall. The temperature had sharply dropped, and the wind howled like a beast caught in the storm. Anton stood there staring out into the thick fog, his breath coming out in visible clouds. He had never felt more isolated. It was then that he saw a flicker of movement in the shadows, a figure running low to the ground as if trying to remain unseen. Anton's heart raced and his grip tightened around his rifle. His instincts screamed at him to act, to stop the intruder before it was too late. But something about the way the figure moved, so frantic, so desperate, stirred a deep, primal unease in him. The figure stopped just short of the wall and looked up. Anton's breath caught in his throat as he met the eyes of the intruder, eyes full of terror, full of something else. Something unseen had gripped them. Anton's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He didn't move. He couldn't. The figure writhed in agony, mouth open in a silent scream, and then it stopped. The thrashing ceased as suddenly as it had started. The figure lay still in the snow. Anton blinked. The figure disappeared, as if it never was there in the first place. It was there one moment and was engulfed by night the next. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the fog, or had something else taken it? Anton's thoughts were running as fast as he could breathe under the crushing silence. He knew he couldn't be there a minute more. Something in the place, the stillness, was off. Days ran into one another after that night. Anton could not rid himself of the feeling that something had changed. He was assigned to a different post, closer to the main station, but it didn't matter. The dread followed him like a shadow, and every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, seemed to whisper of things lurking just out of sight. Anton became obsessed with the disappearance of the figure. Had it really happened? Was it a defector or spy, perhaps a soldier from the other side trying to find their way across? Or something even more sinister? One evening, while Anton sat in the barracks, he listened in to some hushed words of another soldier. Carl, an old-timer on border patrol, was speaking to another man of how soldiers disappeared, never to be seen again, near the wall. "They leave without making even a noise," Carl spoke very quietly, his glance scintillating about the room nervously. "Like they dissolve, like mist into mist, not even that, and also return once in a while. Only when they do they come out. Look." Anton's blood ran cold. He had heard the rumors, stories whispered in hushed tones during late nights, but he had dismissed them. The regime wouldn't let such things happen, or would they? Carl's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've heard things, Anton. Terrible things. At night, when the wind blows, you can hear it. Voices, whispers coming from the wall itself." He shuddered as if remembering something too awful to speak about. Anton's heart was racing as he tried to get his thoughts in order. "Voices? Are you saying that someone, or something, is behind the wall?" Carl nodded slowly. "Not just behind it, in it. I have seen it myself. Soldiers who vanished came back, but they were never the same. They couldn't speak. Their eyes were empty, like they'd seen something that broke them. Some of them died within days." Anton could no longer dismiss it. The wall was more than a boundary. It was a gate to something incomprehensible. But what could it be? What was haunting the border, feeding on the souls of the men stationed there? The paranoia was building inside Anton, and the world was slowly closing in around him. He noticed odd things. Whispers in the wind, fleeting shadows that crossed his field of vision, faces watching him from the corners of his eyes that vanished when he turned to look at them. One night, he was standing alone at the wall when he saw it again, a figure. He had no doubt this time. A soldier, pale and gaunt, emerged from the fog. Anton's breath caught in his throat. It was one of the soldiers who had disappeared weeks ago. Private Marxus. a young man stationed with him at the border. Marcus's eyes were wide, unblinking, focused on Anton. His uniform was ripped to pieces, his face gaunt and hollow. Something is drastically wrong with him. It's enough to make one want to peel the skin from Anton's body. "Marcus," he whispered in a voice raw as coarse wool. The soldier said nothing but stared at him through empty, soulless eyes. Without warning, Marcus's body jerked violently as if something inside him was pulling at his very soul. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a guttural rasp, like the wind caught in a decaying chest. The air around Anton grew cold, and his breath fogged in the freezing night. His body screamed to run, but he was frozen, rooted to the spot. Marcus took a step toward him, his body contorting unnaturally, and Anton finally found his voice. "What do you want?" he choked out. Marcus's lips curled into a grotesque smile, one that didn't belong on a human face. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and discolored. And then, in a voice that was not Marcus's, it whispered, "We are all lost here. Forever." He lunged at Anton, his hand out, clutched to Anton's throat. He was fighting back with every strength he had, but it didn't help. The soldier was not human anymore. It was hollow, a vessel for something darker, something ancient. As darkness closed in, Anton's thoughts turned to the wall, the one thing that had always been there, standing between life and death. The wall had been a symbol of division, of oppression, but now he understood the true horror it held. It was a prison. A prison for souls, a place where the lost could never escape. Anton was cold when his friends found him in the morning with eyes wide from terror. His comrades could explain the marks on his neck or twisted his mouth into a face of expression. They could explain nothing, as he had been left dead near the border where he lived, yards away from the wall, though no one could explain how he was killed. Anton Fisher was another soldier to leave without trace at night. Only the story wasn't over yet, because the horror that had taken him lived behind walls, waited for their next victim to come that would fall to its claws. The years went by, but the fear remained. The soldiers stationed at the wall knew the truth, though none dared speak of it. There was something in the air, something that fed on the souls of those who stood guard. They could feel it watching, waiting. And in the dead of night, when the wind howled and the mist rode in thick as smoke, they heard the whispers. The ones who had vanished, the ones who had become something else, were still there, and they were waiting. It would go unnamed for eternity, but the evil Anton Fisher uncovered never was. It was never simply a wall. It was what was behind it, the monster which feasted on the men to whom it entrusted its defense, the monster that could claim a soul with a glance of its eye. And behind this wall, this vast wall that smothered all the life from a man, stood an endless nightmare. No escape,